In her hand, she squeezed a small ampoule with transparent liquid. Her body was quivering. Her hands were numb. Yevgenia was staring out of the window with a vacant look, just for a moment, to see and remember. She heard footsteps in the corridor and hid in the corner of the hospital ward. With trembling fingers, she cracked the cherished ampoule, closed her eyes, and fell down. Doctors weren't able to save her life. The strong poison, lewisite, had an instant effect. The woman who had committed suicide was called Yevgenia. She was the wife of the People's Commissar of NKVD Nikolai Yezhov. She had taken the poison under the instruction of her powerful husband. Thus, she avoided the terrible torment suffered by her elite friends in the Lubyanka torture chambers. The famously beautiful Kremlin wives. They were envied. Millions treated them as role models. Ordinary Soviet women believed that they lived in the lap of luxury. But no one knew what a terrible price these gorgeous women paid for their privileged status. They were rotting in labor camps and committing suicide to avoid being massacred in the torture chambers of the NKVD. They were tortured, humiliated. No one could help them. Their all-powerful husbands were merely the puppets of Joseph Stalin. (1937), Moscow. Polina Zemchushina gave final instructions to her subordinates and left her office. She didn't want to be late for her friend Yekaterina's birthday. She was the wife of the chairman of the VTSIK, Mikhail Kalinin. A small, exclusive female crowd were invited for the party. Olga, the wife of the commander of the Moscow military district, Marshal Budyonny. Yevgenia, the wife of People's Commissar of NKVD Yezhov. And she, the wife of the chairman of Sovnarkom Molotov. 4 high society ladies, the wives of mighty Soviet kings. A car was already waiting for her. Molotov adored his wife and called her his pearl. He consulted with her and always listened to her opinions. Polina was not afraid to show her independence and self-confidence. Because of this, Molotov had fallen in love with her. The car was taking Polina to the Kremlin. Meanwhile, Olga Budyonaya was saying farewell to her husband, Marshal Budyonny, at their home. She had several plans for the day: a party at Kalinina's place, and then a performance at the Bolshoi Theater. Olga was Budyonny's second wife. Nadezhda, his first, had died under mysterious circumstances. The official version blamed the unsafe handling of a weapon. However, there were rumors that it was suicide because the famous hero of the Civil War had grown tired of Nadezhda. And when she found out about his passion for 19-year-old Olga, she killed herself. The next day, Budyonny brought a new wife to his house. But Johnny always dreamed of having children. But Olga didn't want to risk her career. She enjoyed all the adulation of her professional life. Besides, she was sure that her famous husband loved her the way she was, bright and inspiring. Olga knew the sad story of his first wife. She knew what he was like and was scared that he would lose interest in her. The car was driving through the streets of Moscow. Olga was watching people with interest. Suddenly, she noticed a familiar figure. Yes, it is Yevgenia Yezhova. Who is she talking to so animatedly? Olga smiled to herself. Not her husband, obviously. Since her youth, Yevgenia was addicted to Bohemia. Living in Odessa, she met famous writers such as Katyev, Ilf, Petrov and Babel. She was artistic and cheerful, always interested in remarkable people. Once, she believed that Nikolai Yezhov, silent, mysterious and attractive, was one of them. Friends would ask, "What did you see in him? He's short, ordinary, nothing special." She replied, "He's a rising star." With her woman's intuition, she could tell this guy was going places. But her insight came too late. It turned out that he was silent because he had nothing to say. When filling out forms in the gap-marked education, he would proudly write, "Incomplete hire." Yevgenia was trying to interest her husband in books, theatre and music, but in vain. Apart from his work, the People's Commissar of the NKVD, Yezhov, had no interests. She and her husband were gradually drifting apart. He became closed and distant and paid less and less attention to his wife. Yevgenia drowned her sorrows in the arms of other lovers. She hoped it might excite her distant husband. But all in vain. Yezhov didn't seem to notice. Soon, Yevgenia would regret tying herself to this terrible man. His work would become her curse, and escaping it would cost her her life. Of course, their life wasn't perfect. Yezhov Yevgenia had lovers. There was Uritsky, the editor of Krestianskaya Gazeta, and Babel. Yezhov also had affairs, and not only with women. A klaxon sounded. Yevgenia turned and saw Olga. What good luck! Now they can go to Kalanina together. The party preparations at the Kremlin apartments belonging to the Kalanins were almost over. A festive table, decorated with flowers, bottles of wine, delicate dishes. Yekaterina was a wonderful hostess. Guests were gathering, gifts, kisses, flowers. She and Kalanin had been married for 30 years. Together, they survived the Civil War. They rejoiced when he was elected the chairman of the VTSIK. And now he has won the highest post in the country, chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet. Yekaterina loved her clever husband and tried to be the perfect wife. However, family life wasn't always peaceful. Mikhail Kalanin had never been loyal. His numerous infidelities forced Yekaterina to leave everything and run away from the Kremlin. But eventually, her husband began to settle down. The Kalanins were preparing to grow old with dignity. Parties, friends, sincere smiles. Yekaterina thought, that's what happiness is all about. But Kalinina began to wonder whether the good life was just a wonderful dream. The life of a prisoner who sleeps in a damp cell, freezing cold, and suffering constant beatings. No sleep or food. How could she imagine such a life? Music, singing, poetry. They decided to take a picture to remember the good times. Splendid, successful women smiling into the camera. But none of them could have guessed that in the silence of Stalin's office, their future had already been mapped out. And this picture would be the only reminder of their happy, carefree lives. Olga Budyanaya left with a farewell kiss. She rushed to the theatre, floating on air. For her, each performance was a dream come true. With a sparkle in her eye, Olga ran backstage. "Comrade Budyanaya, you are under arrest." Stunned, Olga didn't say a word as she was removed from the theatre and bundled into a car. The door of the cell slammed shut and Olga was left in the dark. What had happened? Why was she here? And how would her husband find out she was there? Surely there must have been some terrible mistake. Her husband will fix it. He will save her. He will take her away from this horrible place. But Olga didn't realize that she was destined to remain behind the high prison walls. And that influential Budyonny, the war hero and Stalin's favorite, wouldn't even try to rescue her. Red Army commanders were being exterminated. The trial of Marshal Tukhachevsky had begun. Stalin was always afraid of talented and ambitious servicemen and removed them with the help of other servicemen. The hero of the Civil War, the national favorite Budyonny, seemed perfect for the role of prosecutor. And to ensure his good conduct at the trial of Marshal Stalin, he was ordered to take his young wife hostage. Budyonny understood there is no point in contradicting. He knew Stalin. If he had already decided about something, he was unshakable. But what exactly did Stalin want from him? To take part in the trial? Good, he will prosecute, especially since he hates this young upstart Tukhachevsky. Budyonny thought that his obedience would guarantee Olga's release, but he was wrong. Stalin's plans concerning him were more far-reaching. He needed faithful soldiers, devoid of any human weakness. He would only tolerate mild drinking. Stalin was extremely suspicious of friends, wives and girlfriends. And so they were all banned. She returned to consciousness after a blow to the stomach. Instead of a scream, she could only manage a weak wheeze. She pleaded with them to stop. The tortures continued for 2 days. The men in uniform demanded only one thing of Olga: to sign the protocol. One signature and her anguish would cease. But Olga couldn't do it. The document, shoved before her by NKVD, dealt with the espionage activities of her husband, Semyon Budyonny. She couldn't betray her husband and denigrate him. She was beaten mercilessly. All this time, Olga still hoped her husband would come and save her. But the miracle never happened. Exhausted by all the torturing, Budyonaya finally gave them her signature. This was an unheard-of method of controlling the state machinery, a method invented by Joseph Stalin himself. Under fabricated suspicion, a party official's wife was arrested, forced to write a denunciation of her husband, and then sent to a Gulag camp and kept there as a lure. Controlled by fear, their husbands became reliable executors of Comrade Stalin's will. The method, although extremely cynical, was very effective. She was lying on the cold floor of the chamber, feeling numb. Beaten, defiled, devoid of any hope of salvation. Olga was recollecting the last happy hours of her life. Yekaterina Kalenina's party and all her friends. She burst into tears. Why was fate so cruel to her? The memorable party continued. Yevgenia Yezhova kissed Kalenina and hurried home. In a little square near the Kremlin, her old lover was waiting, the famous writer Isaac Babel. Kissing and holding hands, they walked along the lane. They didn't notice a man in civilian clothing watching them from close by. Yevgenia sneaked into the bedroom, turned on the nightlight, and jumped with surprise. Her husband was sitting in the armchair. Yevgenia felt as though she was being interrogated. "So where have you been? Tell me." Gathering her strength, she tried to turn the conversation into a joke. However, Yezhov was in no mood for jokes. Day and night, he works like a dog, purging the party ranks, personally interrogating enemies, unmasking them. How dare she? And with some scribbler who will sooner or later be arrested. The only thing she deserves is a divorce. Unable to control himself, Yezhov slapped Yevgenia's face. But then Yezhov became violent. Yevgenia had achieved her goal. She had her husband's attention at last. But at what cost? She screamed and tried to escape from his grasp. But it only infuriated the commissar even more. He saw before him not a wife, but an ordinary defendant, just like all the others. He threw her to the floor and ran out. It was a terrible shock for Yevgenia. Instead of awakening love and tenderness in her husband, she had unleashed a violent beast. Yevgenia never recovered from the shock. Shortly after, she was found in the Kremlin hospital, diagnosed with asthenodepressive syndrome. Yezhov never visited her and never forgave his wife's adultery. But he never forgot her. These were troublesome times for Yezhov. Beria had been appointed the People's Commissar of Internal Affairs. It was clear that he would remove Yezhov, and Yezhov knew that these were his last days in the NKVD. As he himself said, "I know I'm a gone goose," and he had an idea to burn his bridges to avoid Stalin's attack. They quietly entered the hospital ward. Having heard about their friend's poor health, Yekaterina Kalinina and Polina came to visit her. It was hard to recognize Yevgenia. She had lost weight and her beauty had faded. She stared vacantly into space. Her friends tried to cheer Yevgenia up, joking and sharing all the latest news. But in vain. Her face remained frozen. Having tried everything, the women left. They walked sadly back through the hospital courtyard. Their friend's health had made a painful impression. And then there was the news about Olga. What had happened to her? Why was she arrested? And why was her husband, Marshal Budyonny, not trying to release her? Was this war hero afraid? Everyone was afraid now. Kalinina looked around to find a man walking behind them. Stalin is a sadist. He kills innocent people. What will happen to all of us? Polina sighed. How sad and terrifying. The passerby in the hospital courtyard was also going to visit Yevgenia. He was an agent of People's Commissar Yezhov. Yezhov's couple had an agreement. If the situation becomes critical, Yezhov gives a sign. This sign was to be this trinket. It was brought to the hospital by the man whom Kalinina and Yevgenia had thought was a casual passerby. Nikolai Yezhov knew better than anyone how to organize cases against enemies of the people. He was an author of many of them himself, and lately he felt that his post was under threat. Yezhov just learned that he had been transferred from the post of chairman of the NKVD to the position of People's Commissar of the fishing industry. Now, according to the scenario, his wife was to be arrested. The agent entered the ward. Yevgenia immediately recognized her husband's assistant. He placed a small casket on the bedside table and walked away. She looked at it with horror. She had neither the strength nor the desire to resist. A nervous breakdown had taken away all her energy. She opened the casket and took out an ampoule. She was scared, but Yevgenia knew there was no other way, no escape. It was useless to ask for help. Pictures from her past flashed before her eyes. That last happy evening with her friends seemed so long ago. She was playing the piano and Olga was singing. Then they were drinking champagne and laughing. Anne took a picture to remember. Yevgenia heard steps in the corridor. She held her breath, closed her eyes, and drained the ampoule. In one sense, his wife had been braver than him. Yezhov was very cynical about the fact that his wife had to commit suicide. He said, "Zhenya is a good woman, but I'll have to sacrifice her to save myself." Shortly after his wife's death, the chief of the NKVD was executed. After him, Yezhova's lover, the writer Isaac Babel, was killed. Yekaterina Kalinina looked mournfully at the picture. Olga looked inspired. Yevgenia joyful and beautiful. Both young and cheerful. Her thoughts were interrupted by a phone call. It was a tailor. Her dress was waiting for her. She entered the tailor's. "Galina?" She called out for the tailor. No answer. Why is it so quiet? Where is everybody? She heard a strange rustling behind her, looked around and came face to face with a cold-eyed man dressed in the uniform of the NKVD. Kalinina realized what was happening. 2 months later, Yekaterina signed a confession stating that she was using her apartment for counter-revolutionary meetings, that conspirators were preparing a revolt against Stalin, and that she was aware of their insidious plans. In fact, she had no idea that it was her fault. Olga and Yevgenia couldn't bear interrogations and tortures, and signed all the necessary papers. But she never even thought about her damning words about Stalin. Stalin is a sadist. He kills innocent people. What will happen to all of us? This is what she told her friend Yevgenia in the hospital courtyard, and what the upright and frank Polina related thoughtlessly to her husband Vyacheslav Molotov. Thus signing her friend's death sentence. Stalin did not care what happened to Yekaterina. His goal was Mikhail Kalinin. His position could be compared to the post of a president today. Formally, it was he who led the Soviet Union and represented the country on an international level. Stalin wanted to be 100% sure that the puppet president would not make a single step without approval from the Kremlin. And only one thing could give him that confidence: the personal interest of Kalinin. And his wife's life had become a guarantee of his loyalty as well as her confession, which was stored in a special safe belonging to Lavrenti Beria. It was a finely worked out plan. The victims included thousands of innocent people who back in the camps had been deprived of their names and given serial numbers. The train was full of political prisoners, packed in like sardines. The train was heading to Siberia. The wagons were unbelievably hot. The prisoners were denied food and water and had to beg for them when the train stopped to unload corpses. The corpses of those who didn't manage to withstand the trip. In the adjacent wagons of the train were convicted Kalinina and Yevgenia. These women were heading to different destinations. They didn't meet and never found out that they were heading to camps on the same train. The heat of Kazakh steppe. No clouds, no wind. Scorching sun, thirst and permanent fatigue. Under these conditions, the prisoners of Akhmalinsky camp, including wives of traitors, were building roads. Yekaterina Kalinina, along with the other women, were carrying huge iron girders. As a dangerous criminal, she had to do all the heavy work under supervision. She didn't realize that back in Moscow, old Mikhail Kalinin was begging Stalin to show mercy to his wife. And over time, he softened Iron Cobra. In the camps, there were 3 special departments where traitors' wives were concentrated. They were in Temnigovsky, Siberian and Karagandinsky camps. She was brought to the camp laundry. Several women were washing prisoners' clothes. This became her new workplace. Endless supplications from her husband finally paid off. By special order, she was transferred to easier work, cleaning prisoners' clothes. The so-called work with a pull saved Yekaterina's life. She was allowed to correspond with her husband. She received letters, already opened, creased by other people's hands, defiled by others' eyes. But she did not care. They were the only thread connecting her with the past, with her old life and beloved husband. Kalinin never stopped hoping. Month after month, year after year, he begged Stalin to release his wife. He cried openly without shame, abased himself. This is not the right time. When the war is over, we'll think about it. Stalin kept his promise. On May the 9th, 1945, he gave a personal order. Comrade Kalinina must be forgiven immediately, released and sent to Moscow. Joseph Stalin. World War II had just ended. The country was celebrating victory. Why not afford a royal gesture? Kalinin had fulfilled his duties. He diligently played the role of the president, pretended to make decisions at state level. In fact, for many years, not a single uncoordinated movement or word, only obedience and loyalty. As a reward for his obedience, his wife was returned safely. The train took her to Moscow. Yekaterina looked around cautiously. People passed by without noticing her. Nobody was following her. She did not know what to do now that there was no reason to be afraid, or ask to use the toilet, or go to bed when she was told. Everything had changed, but what's in it for her? Once smart, confident and lively, Yekaterina felt as though she was dead. Ruined from the outside and burnt from the inside. She couldn't let her husband see her like this. She loved him too much, and was afraid he would not want to be with her. Yekaterina didn't return to the Kremlin so as not to upset her husband. She settled in the dacha. And yet Kalinin tracked her down. He quietly closed the gate. Kalinin's knees were trembling. Yekaterina. He has been waiting for her for 9 years. And now they were finally to meet and talk and start a new life. They will age peacefully together, just as they had dreamed. He saw a hunched woman working in the garden. There was no one else around. "Have you seen the mistress?" With difficulty, she stood up. When she turned around, Kalinin froze. His catcher was looking at him. He couldn't speak. This hunched, wrinkled old woman couldn't be her. What had 9 years in the camp done to his wife? He couldn't go near her. Yekaterina felt his resistance and ran away. Kalinin never saw his wife again. Her husband never managed to recover from the shock. A few months later, Mikhail Kalinin died without having talked to the woman he loved. For the rest of her life, Yekaterina remembered the horrors of the camps. At night, she had nightmares about that dreadful train rushing into the unknown. The sound of the wheels brought back terrible memories. The train was carrying her further into Siberia. 10 years of camps and indefinite exile to the Krasnoyarsk region awaited her. There in the small town of Yeniseisk, the former diva of the Bolshoi theater worked as a cleaner in a school. She walked into her little room in the basement of the school. From now on, this would be her home. Here, away from prying eyes, she could be herself once again. Olga threw off her nasty quilted jacket and pulled out a trunk from under the bed. All that was left from her past was the semi-decomposed remains of the dress she was wearing during her arrest. She used to be a singer. She appeared on the stage. She was applauded, given flowers. Had any of it been real? Olga wasn't sure. She carefully put on her costume and started to sing for the first time in years. And then a miracle happened. The little room vanished. And once again, she was standing on the stage in the spotlight, singing her heart out. The audience was applauding her as she lapped up their love and attention. She'd forgotten what it was like. Olga would do anything to experience it again. In the wretched room stood a tired woman in rags, wheezing and coughing. Olga would often put on her costume. It made her feel young and beautiful. At first, Yevgenia only wore it in private, behind closed doors. But eventually, she started to appear in the costume in front of people. She became schizophrenic, scaring townspeople with her strange clothes and fabricated stories about her lifestyle in the Kremlin. She lost her sense of reality and started to rail against the whole world. She had already had some sort of mental illness that worsened after the arrest and all the shock she received. Later, she even claimed that she was raped during her interrogation. She wrote bad things about many people. But it's hard to say if any of it was true, because she was obviously out of her mind. She was already seriously ill. She could not live by herself. She had to be taken care of. Yevgenia looked at a pile of letters. Then she pulled the envelopes out of the trunk and started to sign them. Moscow, Kremlin, to Comrade Stalin. Moscow, Lubyanka, to Comrade Beria. Among these letters was a denunciation of Commissar Molotov's wife, Polina Zhemchushina. Comrade Zhemchushina involved in Zionist conspiracy. I, Olga Yevgenia, personally know that Zhemchushina secretly communicated with her sister, who emigrated during the Civil War. Olga threw the letters into the mailbox. The letter with the denunciation came in handy. Exactly at that time, Stalin was putting Molotov out of business, and there was a need for guarantees. Aware of party intricacies, Molotov had to keep Kremlin secrets after his dismissal. And to guarantee his silence, they threatened to arrest his wife, his beautiful Pearl. At Politburo meeting, they were discussing the expulsion of Comrade Zhemchushina from the party. She supports international Zionism, and there is no place for people like that in the party. Who votes? Everyone but Molotov. Who votes against? Silence. Who abstains? People's Commissar Molotov timidly raised his hand. The decision is made. However, the next day, Molotov wrote Stalin a letter of repentance in which he admitted his lack of objectivity and voted after the event. It was a forced betrayal. After all, Vyacheslav Molotov knew the rules. His wife is only the first call, and he can do nothing about it. He'll be next, and then it will be his daughter's turn. Svetlana Molotova was 20 and had to share her mother's fate or repudiate her in public. By betraying his wife, Molotov was trying to protect his daughter. Yezhova was already sitting in the investigator's office at the Lubyanka. During interrogations, a proud Polina confessed nothing and signed nothing. But only because investigators didn't apply physical force. Molotov, who voted for her expulsion from the party, has clearly displayed his loyalty. And now, to please Stalin, it was enough just to send her away. A beggar was shuffling through a little market. Local tradeswomen knew of this old, exhausted woman. She never buys anything, only looks. The beggar's face was familiar to all. In the past, photos of the brilliant wife of Sovnarkom chairman, Polina Yezhova, often appeared in newspapers. She had recently been a powerful woman in the USSR. And now she was just another ex-prisoner, like thousands of others. The tradeswomen were spiteful about her, but she did not listen. She turned around and walked away. Here in exile, at the edge of the world, in the far Kostanay region, she didn't even have a name. In documents, Yezhova was called Object Number 12. For 4 years, Polina had been living alone in a hut. She even asked for a cat to keep her company. But the most horrible reminder from those years was the constant hunger. Only thoughts of her beloved husband had kept her going. In her memoirs, Polina wrote, 4 years apart, 4 eternities. Only the thought of you and that you might still need me kept me alive. In January 1953, she was secretly brought to Moscow for supplementary investigation. This time because of a so-called doctor's case. Then, already gravely ill, Stalin received a denunciation claiming that a group of medics was organizing a plot, and their goal was to poison the faithful members of the Politburo and Comrade Stalin himself. In response, the leader declared the hunt was on for criminals in white coats. And since most of the accused doctors were Jews, they began to look for a connection to international Zionism. Molotov's wife was treated with partiality. Polina was sure, this time Stalin will not content himself with exile. And she was ready to face her death with dignity. But fate decided otherwise. On March 5, 1953, Stalin died. The USSR was plunged into mourning. On March 9th, the whole country said goodbye to the father of nations. A gloomy Molotov was sitting in his office. Ironically, March the 9th was his birthday. Once upon a time, he and Polina had arranged exciting celebrations. His wife prepared surprises, wrote poems. Beria quietly entered the office. Milich, what present would you like for your birthday? Give Polina back to me. Polina walked into the investigator's office and froze. At the desk sat Lavrenti Beria himself. Her heart sank. That's it. The end. Why is he here? The chairman of the NKVD came out from behind his desk and handed her a document. It was a letter of pardon. She blacked out. Polina fell to the floor. The same day, Polina Yezhova, exhausted by torture, was returned to her husband. A worker from the NKVD carried her to the apartment. She could not walk on her own. Sitting by her bedside, he looked at his wretched and ruined Yezhova. There were no tears, no words. In 1953, the period of rehabilitation started. Immediately after Stalin's death, a review of cases of repression was announced. Many people convicted under the infamous Article 58 were released. The case reviewed. Components of crime not found. Not found. On the street, people appeared carrying the same plywood trunks, former political prisoners. An aging, exhausted ex-prisoner stopped in front of a luxurious oak door with the sign, Budyonny Semyon Mikhailovich. Few would recognize her as the former beauty, Olga Budyonnaya. She knocked. A beautiful young woman with a baby in her arms opened the door. She looked at the stranger with surprise. "Who do you need?" Olga froze. It was her cousin Maria. Budyonny married her as soon as he learned that Olga had been given a life sentence. However, Budyonny learned about the return of his wife, but did not dare meet her. Instead, he interceded and granted her a flat in Moscow as compensation for the moral damages. 1957. Two elderly women walked through the dark corridor of a communal flat. Polina Yezhova and Yekaterina Kalanina. The friends stopped at the door with a sign, Olga Stepanovna Budyonnaya, a soloist of the Bolshoi Theatre. Olga was laying a table with newspapers instead of cloths. A bottle of vodka, bread and herring. Olga drank glass after glass until she became drunk. Polina swept crumbs from the table and hid them in her pocket. Her fear of hunger never left her. Yevgenia sat down at the old piano. The once beautiful voice now sounded more like a wheeze. Her piano playing sounded awful. Having put the drunk Olga to bed, friends opened up the piano lid. The piano was full of empty bottles. Their attention was drawn to the only decoration in the shabby room. A photo hanging above Olga's bed. On closer examination, it was that picture of the 4 radiantly successful women. The wives of famous, influential men who paid dearly for their star status.
Возвращая ваш портрет, я любви вас не молю, в моем письме упрека нет, я вас по-прежнему люблю.